Hello everyone, my name is Edgar Maraguat, and this is my video presentation for the workshop on teleology and Hegel's logic. The title of the talk is Hegel's Proto-Darwinism, as announced. The aim of the talk is to argue that a correct understanding of the central doctrines about teleology in the science of logic will help to see Hegel as belonging to Darwin's intellectual family tree, forming part of the branch in which Darwinism grows out of the traditional intellectual vitalist and finalist trunk. So it's not that Hegel was a direct ancestor or someone who influenced Darwin somehow. It's rather that he, in my view, belongs to the intellectual context of ideas in which Darwin's biological revolution happened in the 19th century. I guess this sounds implausible, because of course, if you recall, the main Darwinian doctrines characteristic of his revolution, the revolution he favored in our biological thinking, like for instance the non-constancy of life forms and common descent of current forms from a few remote amount of not anymore existent original life forms, even just one eventually, and also gradualism in the emergence of new and more recent forms, and finally and most importantly natural selection as the main explanation of this emergence. If you take into account all this, and then on the other hand Hegel's very explicit rejection of an actual production in time of natural forms, then my attempt today will seem at first desperate. Look at Hegel's rejection of the so-called emergence of, for instance, plants and animals out of water and other forms, and of the more highly developed animal organizations out of the lower, etc., in this 249 paragraph in the remark. My talk is gonna have three parts, three central parts, and then some conclusions. In the first, I'd like just to specify a bit, which is the interpretive challenge that we face here, be a specific challenge. I think it's you can see this if you consider Hegel's central claims with regard to teleology in the science of logic. I think there are two, H1 and H2. The first is that teleology in general is the truth of mechanism, and this is the conclusion apparently of the chapters of the science of logic devoted to mechanism and chemical mechanism. And the second more important lesson is H2, that internal teleology is the truth of external teleology, which is actually the conclusion of the chapter in the logic dedicated to teleology as such. I think the problem for my purpose comes mostly from H1, from this claim of Hegel's that teleology is the truth of mechanism, which sounds really as a non-Darwinian claim, because if you take H1 as a claim with regard to what explains what, then it sounds really non-Darwinian that there's a teleological explanation of mechanical or mechanical processes or the mechanical natural production of something. Consider that if we interpret mechanism as it actually is, a combination of necessity and chance, a combination of arguably necessary causal relations, and then the coincidence, by the coincidence of some of them at a certain point and in somewhere, then you'll see that natural selection, this general explanation of the emergence of natural forms by Darwin, is precisely a combination of variation by chance, so chance, and then necessity, the necessity by which the better adapted, the better living entities that can better cope with their environment are selected, using this Darwinian metaphor, and then just have more offspring and then prevail in the long run. So natural selection is this combination, like the concept of mechanism, a combination of these two principles. So it's like Darwin, it seems like Darwin is claiming precisely the inversion of Hegel's claim, rather that mechanism is the truth of teleology and not otherwise. It's natural selection, the explanation, the adequate explanation of everything that in nature is or seems to be purposeful, functional, a good choice, etc. And consider, on the other hand, how Hegel receives Aristotle's rejection of the hypothesis that a combination of necessity and chance or coincidence could explain what seems to be purposeful in nature. This is a famous passage from the books on physics. I'll read it and then what Hegel says about this. What then, says Hegel, is to stop parts in nature too from being like this, the front teeth of necessity growing sharp and suitable for biting, and the back teeth broad and serviceable for chewing the food, not coming to be for this, because somebody has had this purpose or designed them with this purpose, but by coincidence. And similarly with the other parts in which the for something seems to be present. So when all turned out just as if they had come to be for something, then the things suitably constituted as an automatic outcome survived. And when not, they died, and die, as Empedocles says, of the man-headed calves. This is the passage, and this is Hegel's reaction, Hegel's remark. Empedocles, as Hegel, carried out this idea particularly well. He presented the first emergence as a world of the most diverse monsters, which, however, could not have survived as such, but perished because they were not suitable for their surroundings. It is an idea which a natural philosophy can easily come up with, that the first productions are, as it were, attempts by nature, Versuche der Natur, of which those could not remain which did not show themselves to be useful. Aristotle, Hegel goes on the other hand, says it is impossible to have this idea. It means you can't have this idea, you can't accept this, because what comes to be by nature comes to be always, or at least for the most part. Anyone who accepts that accidental formation cancels nature and the natural. End of quote. This is first Aristotle's rejection of what we call a mechanism, or this combination of necessity and coincidence, as being able to explain functional natural parts of natural entities, and also Hegel's rejection of it. It's like they're both rejecting this apparently proto-Darwinian claim of Empedocles. So this is the challenge, actually, that we make sense of this remarks in the lessons on Aristotle, as to bring together somehow, or bring closer Darwin to Hegel, and then being able to claim that there's some proto-Darwinian important element in Hegel's accounts. Now this is part number 2. In part number 2, the non-truth of mechanism, I'd like to offer an interpretation of this claim of Hegel in the Science of Logic, considering with certain detail how he comes to this conclusion in the work. To do this, we should first recall how Hegel introduces the concept of mechanical object in the Science of Logic. It has 3 traits. The first is that it is essentially indeterminate as a causal principle. The second is that it is indifferent to the termination, an eventual determination that it can have, again as a causal principle. And the third is that when determined, after all, it is determined from the outside. And this is, an attempt at illustrating this concept with a pair of pictures. This is the first. You see here M, the mechanical object, allegedly producing an effect, but it can produce this effect insofar as some other objects outside itself determine it to influence, have some influence on something else. So it's only with the participation of these other objects around M that this can happen. This is one illustration, and then there's another aspect of this lack of determination that I try here to convey. Look, it's not only other objects around that have a say on this, that somehow push the M object, this mechanical object, to have some effect. It's also that the alleged effect, or as Hegel puts it, the passive substance allegedly being influenced, must also allow this influence on itself from the mechanical object. So it's not for Hegel, it's not adequately understood as a one-way influence. The alleged effect must somehow also co-determine the relation, the causal relation. Hegel himself gives an example of this in the Science of Logic. A sheet hanging freely in the air is not penetrated by a musket ball. Why? Not because the musket ball is not a musket ball, but because the sheet doesn't allow this effect that the basketball goes through the sheet. It's too light if it's floating in the air. So it's the passive substance, the sheet here, should allow this causal influence to occur, and in this example is not cooperating, so to speak. So the general picture is rather of a mess of influences and determinations coming from an indeterminate amount of other objects around. So any one of the single M objects is participating somehow in a global and joint determination of effects and events then happening, and apparently causal relations happening. So of course you can think that this is an exaggeration of Hegel. He wants to stress this indeterminacy, and many readers read Hegel on mechanical objects as exaggerating. Even Robert Pepin does this, but I think this is wrong. You should take this literally. Hegel defends that there's an essential and absolute indeterminacy here. And I think he is not alone. I mean, I think this is more defensible than that you can initially think. See, for instance, Wittgenstein's approach to these issues in the philosophical investigations. In paragraph 6 of the investigations, he imagines again a dialogue, and then someone says, well, I set the brake up by connecting up rod and lever. And then this has some effect on the machine. And the interlocutor, the philosopher, answers, well, yes, given the whole of the rest of the mechanism. Because only in conjunction with that is it a brake lever. And separated from its support, it's not even a lever. It may be anything or nothing. I think this is a very brief, a very brief statement of the exact position that Hegel is taking regarding mechanisms. Mechanisms are essentially, a piece of mechanism is essentially anything, can participate in the production of anything, and by itself it produces nothing. It's only in conjunction with this rest, with this whole of the rest, as Wittgenstein puts it. This is how Hegel in the Science of Logic comes to the conclusion that it's rather interaction that we find here. It's interaction among the many objects that we encounter in a certain context. Interaction is the truth of causality. Of single, allegedly single causal relations that we can think that we observed. It's rather an interaction that we find everywhere if we look carefully. So mechanical explanations as such, efficient causal explanations in which you say, well, this A is causing B. These explanations are for Hegel empty and arbitrary, because the picking of an object as if its presence, its activity could explain something particular is always untrue. It's always an abstraction of many relevant, essential things that are contributing to. Nevertheless, Hegel in the Science of Logic is looking for the remedy for this situation. Is there any better explanation? How could we avoid this indeterminacy, this emptiness, this arbitrariness? I think he believes that there's a remedy for this, an objective remedy, so to speak, and it is found in just more robustness of the relations and, of course, a certain arrangement of the objects, or more precisely, of course, in the arrangement that makes possible a regime of causality that we can call self-production or self-causation, even then self-organization, if this regime organizes again and again the bunch of objects we can eventually consider. Look, this is again the illustration of the indeterminacy. Even with interaction, what we get is an indeterminate whole of indefinite whole of interactions here, and the remedy comes from, as I said, more robustness and a certain arrangement. And when this happens, a certain boundary around a particular set of objects is somehow built, and relative autonomy is developed, and then the self-explanatory character of this whole, of the existence of this whole. And Hegel sees the truth here because it's contained in the concept of the arrangement and these robust relations that we have, an adequate explanation. I mean, the explanation, because this set of objects arranged in this manner, they somehow repel the influence of other things, other objects from the outside, and then act jointly in a certain way. So a relative, as I said, a relative independency, self-sufficiency, and autonomy grows here. This is the remedy. This is then a different object, which we can explain in a way that we cannot explain a singular efficient causal relation for reasons already considered. And instead of determination from without, from the outside, here we face self-determination, as I said, and instead of a one-way determination, each part of this whole, of this set, acts as means and purpose for the rest. And here is where Hegel thinks that a teleological determination is in place. Here, Hegel thinks that we find finally a teleological object. Why? Because each M part or member of this set is there in this whole active because it does what it does. So in its effect, in the end result of the activity of each of these parts, we find the explanation of its activity, of the activity of this part. So a circular relation, a self-relation grows here, and this is the ground for the teleological conception of this because of these self-causing relations that emerge here. This is how Hegel defends that the concept of purpose as an objective value in the sense of logic. And if I have convince you of this, how this works, and the sense that this truth of teleology in the logic works, then in part 3 now I'd like to compare how Darwin would approach these subjects by means of an example. Now it's more at the tour, but if you come along with me for a while, I hope that you, in the end, you could see how close they are against against our first impression of a conflict, of a contradiction here. Part 3 is about the subordination of mechanism, because mechanisms exist, of course, although they are epistemically or explanatorily somehow deficient in Hegel's eyes. And then my example to illustrate this, the objective relation between mechanisms and teleological objects, and mechanical explanations and teleological explanations, my example will be mitochondria, a biological example. And the question is, why do plant and animal cells have mitochondria? Mitochondria are, of course, these red organelles in modern cells, in eukaryote cells. Biologists say they are sausage-shaped red organelles. You can see 3 of them in this illustration. And there are 2 answers. I'm going to consider 2 answers to this why question. Why are they there? The first is this. It seems that ancestors of modern cells engulfed bacteria in a very long time ago, and then these bacteria are then ancestors of modern mitochondria. Mitochondria were bacteria that somehow entered cells without mitochondria in a very remote past time. This answer is importantly due to this biologist, Lynn Margulis, in the 60s and 70s in the 20th century. She struggled, she fought for to convince biologists of the plausibility of this story. This is called the endo-symbiotic theory, and today is a standard knowledge in biology textbooks. You see here her own illustration of this event. It's very schematic on the left side, of this slide. Aerobic bacteria and then a prokaryotic host, and then they got together, and then mitochondria containing an amoeboid appeared on Earth, and they could cope with their environment. So, they're the ancestors of our cells. On the other side, you see a current illustration from a textbook, and it's so schematic as Margulis actually. As you see, it's not only mitochondria that are explained by means of this theory, it's also chloroplast, and even the nucleus is likely an outsider that came through the membrane of some proto-eukaryotes. Another illustration here, a slightly more detail. You see step number 3, an aerobic proteobacterium enters the eukaryote, and you see the bacterium entering through the membrane. It's typical of these descriptions and illustrations a certain amount of inaccuracy. Look at this step number 3 again. The proteobacterium and the proteobacterium enters the eukaryote. But of course, it was not an eukaryote before the proteobacterium entered and stay and find a good place to live there. eukaryotes are precisely cells with these organelles and some others. But look, even Lynn Margulis is a bit sloppy, I think, when she, in this paper, 1971, describes the central process, the central event here. Endo-symbiosis, she said, has been characterized as swallowing without digesting. Swallowing without digesting. And she thinks this is fine. This is an okay description of this process. But of course, it's not the best one possible. So this is the first answer to my why question. Why mitochondria today? And an explanation: because of engulfment of all bacteria, because of swallowing without digesting, in Lynn Margulis' words. You could illustrate this adapting a cartoon by Sidney Harris. You see, this is meant to illustrate the origin of life in general, not of eukaryotes. So long ago, two amino acids drift together, but then some seconds later, they drift apart. But then again, 400 million years later, two amino acids drift together, and then life developed out of this. And this is this, you see, the emphasis is put here in the contingency of this whole process. And I have adapted this for my purpose here. The origin of eukaryotes is 2,300 million years approximately, although we are uncertain about this. The two prokaryotes drift together, but then some seconds later, they drift apart, and fortunately, some million years later, again, two prokaryotes collide and met and drift together, and then this time, luckily, eukaryote cells were formed slowly, and then so we get to complex organisms like multicellular organisms like ourselves. This is the first explanation. The second one, the second answer to my why question is this: 2. Mitochondria allow cells, animal and plant cells, to breathe. This is a very different answer, of course. It has to do with some complex chemical processes that inside mitochondria happen on a regular basis. It's aerobic respiration in the mitochondria. You see here a textbook illustration of this very complex mechanical process. This can be described different ways. For instance, you can say mitochondria metabolize sugar to form ATP, or you can say that they oxidate organic compounds to extract energy. Or, well, you can say, as I said, that they are responsible for aerobic respiration in the cell. All of these descriptions are, as you see, teleological answers to my why question. Because you see, metabolize sugar to form ATP, oxidate organic compounds to extract energy. So there's a function here, there's a purpose. They're doing something to achieve some result, some end result. Teleological explanations, because they are mitochondria are responsible for this, have a function in the cell. Question is now, of course, which one is the better explanation? There's a better explanation. Should we give the mechanical explanation, this long story, or should we prefer the teleological functional explanation? Well, we're happily in the situation not to choose. We don't have to choose. We can combine both, of course, and this is for sure a more encompassing, probably a full explanation, a much better explanation, a complete explanation of the existence of mitochondria in modern cells, eukaryotic cells. Because, it was the recruiting, if you allow me this common among biologists metaphor, recruiting this invader, this trespasser, this bacterium, for contributing to the regime of metabolism, of self-production that the proto-eukaryotic cells already were, but then it was recruited and a new regime developed out of this. So they became, this bacteria, symbionts. They could live there in there and contribute to the life of this newly constituted whole. The M explanation, taken in itself, is, according to Hegel, abstract. It's just a small element of this more encompassing story. And I mean, I think Hegel is actually right. It's untrue as such, because certainly the swallowing, the engulfment, explains by itself nothing, cannot explain anything. And this is actually what you see here in the cartoon. The event depicted in the first frame explains nothing. 6 seconds later, they could drift apart. And then of course there's a central element in this story, but it's not in the cartoon. That's why the cartoon emphasizes a contingency. A fourth frame should be added to offer an answer of the existence, even if you want this evolutionary story. It's just the missing fourth frame in which symbiosis could be added, and because this is what is doing the trick actually. The symbiotic relation that developed after this drifting together of two prokaryotes in a remote past time. So there was a subordination of the event of the engulfment, and that is a subordination of mechanism in a very Hegelian sense. The symbiosis in the fourth frame, in the missing frame, retroactively gives significance to the engulfment. In the cartoon, the first frame is engulfment with no consequence. Engulfment as such explains nothing. It is the fourth frame, the missing fourth frame, that gives significance to the third frame, to this second engulfment so many years, million years later. This is Aufhebung des Mechanismus, I would say. Mechanical or chemical technique, says Hegel in The Science of Logic, because of its character of being externally determined, naturally offers itself to the connection of purpose. In my example, the engulfment naturally offers itself to the connection of purpose. The connection of purpose was existent already within the host cell, but developed out of this a new regime of self-production, as I said, and the bacterium that entered this other cell was there offering itself to this new connection. And look, this theory of the endo-symbiotic theory, as I said before, Margolis struggled a lot to convince the colleagues, because for the common then new Darwinian paradigm, it's always a mutation that is in the origin of variation. And her theory was, of course, different. It was that the source of novelty, the source of a new not only a new species, but a whole new kingdom of living entities was different, was not a inaccuracy in the reproduction of some already living entity. It was this exogen source, this engulfment precisely. But of course, Margulis thought that her story is, after all, a Darwinian one, because it was the survival of the more functional eukaryote, better equipped, better adapted as other prokaryotes to cope with an environment full of oxygen. That explains the existence, the success of this kind of symbiont, and then the existence today of cells that contain mitochondria. The question is, how Hegelian is this a story? Okay, I grant that the subordination in time, in a long time, million years, 1,000 million years, is not Hegelian. But as you know, an actual subordination of something mechanical, something even non-organic, in the so-called, by Hegel, vital process, by digestion, by integration in the already constituted metabolism. This is Hegelian. So subordination of mechanism to an existent teleological process or object, if you want, is of course Hegelian, is the core of the vital process described abstractly in the sense of logic and more detail in the philosophy of nature. Endo-symbiosis is not swallowing without digestion, actually, as Margulis not carefully put it in 1971. It's rather swallowing plus digestion. Digestion meaning here the symbiosis that developed out after the swallowing. And this is what happens actually when organisms, also for Hegel, subordinate some elements, some outside elements, the swallowing precisely. They digest part of it, and this has a place in the inside the already constituted organism, and then you could say perhaps that it's a symbiosis that develops out of this. This is how we come to my conclusions, my concluding remarks. Very briefly now, I'm finishing. Darwinian explanations, in my view, like Hegelian explanations, emphasize above all the symbiotic process. The living regime of self-production, they are then both teleological explanations. If you think that Margulis was giving a Darwinian explanation, and I think she was, and then you add this fourth frame, which is the most important one actually, then the story, the whole Darwinian story, is a story where the teleological element of the constitution of some functionality is the decisive element. And so both are giving actually a internally teleological explanation. If the endo-symbiotic theory is Darwinian, although the physical source of variation is non-standard, as I said, because it's not a mutation, some inaccuracy in the production of offspring, then we could admit that the endo-symbiotic theory could be seen as a Hegelian theory explanation answer to my why question. Although the temporal location, in this case of subordination, is non-standard from a Hegelian perspective, because Hegel thinks of an actual, the digestion of food and elements and salts in plants and whatever. It's happening now. It's an actual current process. But if you admit that we can have Darwinian explanations with non-standard source of variation, then why not admit also that you can have a Hegelian explanation with a different location of the in time of the subordination of the mechanical. On my last slide, Hegel's Proto-Darwinism. You can defend that there's a central element of Proto-Darwinism in Hegel if you, with me, accept the following three claims. One, with regard to Hegel, teleology based on organization, and organization based on interdependent mechanisms that are, as I described, robustly and in a certain arrangement that allows to have this joint effect of a self-production. Secondly, if you read Hegel as claiming that mechanical explanations are abstract, if not subordinated to teleological explanations in the way that I have illustrated by means of my example. And thirdly and finally, if you read Darwin as offering evolutionary explanations of the origin of natural living forms that are essentially and mostly teleological explanations that emphasize the functionality of organisms, living organisms, even when they change and some then, like here in the endo-symbiotic theory, the collision of two of them then brings about somehow something new. This must be again something functional, even more functional in a sense, and then this is the central element, this functionality in the Darwinian explanations too. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you found this interesting. I'm really looking forward to our discussions and the discussion of this talk. Let me just add that, that I thank you so much for taking part and sending your presentations, and then I'm sure we will have very lively and very interesting then conversations the third week of October. Bye-bye.